I spent 15 years being the best father I could be to my daughter Melody, only to hear her say at her wedding, "My real dad is walking me down the aisle, not you." She was talking about Kenneth, the man my ex-wife Diane married 3 years ago. But what destroyed me wasn't her rejection at the altar. It was what I found in the unmarked package waiting at my doorstep when I got home. My name is Nathan Bridgewater, and I'm 48 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been a single father to my daughter Melody, who just turned 23 last month. I run a veterinary clinic here in our small Missouri town, the same one my father started 40 years ago. It's the kind of quiet town where no one locks their doors, where Sunday mornings still smell like biscuits and coffee, and where people wave before they even know your name. But it's also the kind of town where truth doesn't stay buried forever. Not even the kind that's been rotting underground for years. Melody is my only child. My whole world since the day she opened her eyes and curled her tiny hand around my finger. When Diane left, Melody was only 8. I still remember that morning. Her cereal bowl half finished. Her mother's note next to it, like someone had just stepped into the next room and forgotten to come back. She didn't fight for custody. She didn't even call on birthdays. I raised Melody alone. School projects, broken hearts, doctor visits, piano recitals, all of it. Every father-daughter dance, every scraped knee, every laugh, every tear. I was there. That's why what she said at that altar wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. Before I move on to what happens next, subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The wedding was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. I had bought a new suit, not rented, bought, because I thought it was a day worth keeping in the closet forever. A symbol of a chapter closing beautifully. Instead, it became the suit I never want to see again. The ceremony was outside, under one of those wooden archways wrapped in fake ivy and twinkle lights. Melody looked beautiful, she really did. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself believe I was still her dad in her eyes. The music started. I stood up instinctively. I always pictured taking that first step with her, hand in hand, like we had walked through every other chapter of life. But then I heard her voice. Cold. Final. Sit down. My real dad is walking me. She didn't whisper it. She didn't soften it. She didn't even look at me. She said it like a correction, like someone had mistaken me for a stranger interfering in her ceremony. Kenneth looked at me with this smug little smile, the kind a man wears when he thinks he's won something that was never his to begin with. I sat down, not because I agreed, but because standing there any longer would have shattered me in front of 100 people. Out of habit, or maybe instinct, I scanned the crowd to see if Diane noticed. She didn't. She was too busy, dabbing fake tears and holding Kenneth's arm like she was mother of the year. The same woman who vanished for a decade suddenly got to be mom again when the spotlight came back on. After the I-dos, I tried to speak to Melody, not to fight, not to argue. I just wanted a real goodbye, or at least a reason. But she avoided me. She hugged guests I'd never met before she even came near me. When she finally did, she said, "Thank you for coming." The way store clerks say come again with a dead smile. And that was it. No hug. No I love you, no, Dad. I didn't stay for the reception. I told myself it was because I had work early the next morning. But the truth was, I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. I couldn't sit there listening to people toast a version of history that erased me like I was a placeholder until the real father arrived. The drive home felt longer than the 20 minutes it actually was. I didn't cry in the church. I didn't cry in the parking lot. But when I pulled into my driveway and saw that small brown package leaning against my front door, no return address, no label, just my name handwritten, I knew before I even opened it that life wasn't done with me yet. I took it inside, sat down at the kitchen table where Melody once colored homework pages while I made grilled cheese sandwiches, and just stared at it for a while. The cardboard was worn like it had been handled more than once, like someone almost didn't send it, and then did. When I opened it, I didn't find an object. I found a choice, because inside was a diary, not Melody's, Diane's, and not from yesterday, but from before she left, the kind of pages that weren't meant to be read by anyone except the person who wrote them. The kind of pages that explained things no child was ever meant to discover. This late in life, before we move on to what happens next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of this story. And tell me in the comments, if you were in my place, would you have opened that diary or walked away? I didn't open the diary right away. I just sat there with it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, not the physical kind, but the kind you feel in your gut, deep and low, like something is about to tilt your world in a direction you can't undo. The leather cover was cracked at the edges, like it had been thumbed through more times than a person wants to admit. There was a ribbon bookmark tucked halfway in, pressed between two swollen pages, tear-wrinkled pages. And suddenly I wasn't thinking about Melody or Kenneth or that wedding. I was back to the morning Diane walked out, the coffee pot still on, her closet half empty, the silence so loud it rang in my ears. For years I believed her when she said she needed to find herself. For years I told Melody her mother loved her. She was just broken. For years, I protected a woman who never protected us. I opened the diary to the first page. If he ever finds out, everything is over. No date, no greeting, just that sentence. I remember whispering out loud, finds out what? I kept reading. Diane wrote about me like I was furniture, a placeholder, a reliable structure to lean on while she built a different life in her head. She wrote about the town like it was a cage and I was the warden, as if stability was some kind of imprisonment. She didn't leave because she needed space. She left because she had already chosen a different life. Long before the day she physically walked out, I flipped further, hands shaking without realizing it. Then, I found it. A name. Kenneth. Not 3 years ago. 15. 15 years ago. Long before she ever left. Long before Melody was old enough to spell betrayal, she was already seeing him. Already confiding in him. Already telling him things she never told me. He wasn't the new husband. He was the original replacement. Their relationship started when Melody was 8, the year she disappeared. Suddenly everything made horrifying sense. The detachment, the coldness, the way she had already emotionally erased herself as a mother before she legally did it. I gripped the table. Because the further I read, the uglier it became. Entry after entry she complained that I was too devoted to Melody, that she felt like the third wheel in her own home, that motherhood wasn't the dream she wanted, that she only stayed because leaving without a safety net would be too risky. Not too painful, not too confusing, too risky. Kenneth was her safety net, her soft landing, Plan A disguised as Plan B. In one entry she wrote, "Once Melody is old enough to not need him, I'll go. She already prefers me less. It won't be as dramatic if I wait." She timed her exit. She scheduled motherhood like an obligation with an expiration date. By the time I reached the halfway mark, I had to stand up and walk away from the table. My chest felt tight, not angry tight, but grief tight. The kind that comes from finally understanding that something you carried as your failure was never yours to begin with. I wasn't abandoned because I was unworthy. I was abandoned because she was already gone before I ever knew I was losing her. It was like finding a map that led back to a wound you thought had already scarred over, only to discover it was still bleeding under the surface. I closed the book for a moment, but I couldn't unsee the words that were now in my head. I wasn't just reading her diary. I was meeting the woman she really was for the first time. And she was a stranger. And the most terrifying thought wasn't what else would I find. It was, did Melody know? Did she choose Kenneth because she believed he was the real father figure? Or did her mother rewrite history so slowly, so subtly that Melody never stood a chance? There were still more pages, and something told me the worst part wasn't behind me. It was ahead. I sat there for a long time at my kitchen table, just staring at that diary. Not even reading anymore. Just staring. Like it might suddenly tell me what to do next if I looked hard enough. Eventually, I picked it back up, because I already knew there was no going back. Once you open a door like that, it doesn't close again. The next section was dated closer to the year Diane actually left. The tone was different too. Not secretive, not hesitant, but entitled, comfortable, almost smug. She wrote about Kenneth like he was the real partner she had deserved all along. Like I was some trial run she had been forced to endure until she found something more exciting. But then, somewhere between the entries about new clothes and new beginnings, her handwriting shifted. Smaller, unsteady, and she started writing about Melody. Not lovingly, not maternally, but strategically. She idolizes Nate. That bond is going to be a problem. I need her to slowly detach so she doesn't fight me when I leave. My throat went dry. Problem. She called her own daughter's love for her father a problem. She wrote about pulling back affection on purpose. She wrote about letting Melody cry alone so she would get used to emotional distance. She wrote about undermining me. Softly. Quietly. So Melody would begin to question me without knowing why. Not abuse in the way people picture abuse. No yelling. No hitting. Just cold engineering. The slow rearranging of loyalty. Brick by brick. I had always believed Melody's distance as a teenager came from anger or hurt or confusion. I never imagined it might have been constructed. Because a child who feels rejected by a mother clings to the parent who stays. Unless the mother convinces her that the parent who stayed is the one who failed. There was one line in particular I had to read 3 times to accept it was real. Once she's old enough to reframe her childhood, Kenneth can step in as the nurturing father figure. He'll look good by comparison. By comparison. She was manufacturing the comparison. She didn't just leave us. She rewired the narrative before she walked out the door. I remember closing the diary again, pressing my palm against the cover just to breathe. Because there are some truths you don't just learn. You collide with them. Hard. And when I finally kept reading, I reached the entry that answered the question I had been dreading since the moment I saw the first page. Did Melody know? The answer was there. She didn't know, but she was guided. Diane wrote about slowly planting the idea over years. A comment here, a comparison there, a sigh when I enforced curfew, a smile when Kenneth said yes, not loyalty, not love. Conditioning. And suddenly, the wedding made a horrifying kind of sense, because Melody wasn't choosing a father that day. She was completing a narrative she had been taught to believe was hers. When I reached the ribbon bookmark in the diary, the one wedged between those wrinkled, tear-soaked pages, I braced myself, because if everything I had read so far was the scaffolding, I knew this section was going to be the collapse. Before I turned the page, I remember leaning back and whispering into the empty room. I wasn't just replaced. I was erased, and that's when I realized something I never expected. This diary wasn't a confession, it was a blueprint. And on the next page was the part of the blueprint she never intended anyone to see. Before we get into that, if you're here with me so far, take a second to subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps keep these going, because the next part, it isn't just about Diane, it's about Melody and what she never knew. I turned the page, and right at the top, in bold, pressured handwriting, was a date burned into my memory. 2 weeks before she left. The entries before it were cold strategy. This one was frantic. The handwriting slanted sideways, like she wrote it while shaking, and the very first sentence nearly dropped me to my knees. It's happening sooner than I planned. He suspects something. She didn't name me. She didn't have to. The next paragraphs were like listening to a recording of a past I never knew I lived through. She wrote that she had been preparing Melody slowly. That much I already knew. But she also wrote something I never expected. She didn't leave because she was unhappy. She left because she got caught. That week, I remember noticing she had gotten distant, sleeping in the guest room a couple nights, saying she was overwhelmed, brushing me off when I tried to talk. Now I knew why. She was accelerating the exit, not falling apart, fleeing exposure. Then came the part that made the air feel heavy in my lungs. He thinks I'm slipping away emotionally. But if he digs further, he'll find receipts. If he finds out about Kenneth before I take Melody with me, she'll hate me. And I need her to choose me. Choose. Like a campaign strategy, not a family. She talked about moving states before filing, because courts tend to side with the parent who already has physical possession of the child. She knew exactly what she was doing. Not running to another life, but running ahead of a consequence. She wasn't wounded. She was calculating. And then, the manipulation turned darker. There was a line where she wrote, "She trusts him more than me, for now. So I have to break that before she's old enough to form her own framework. Break that, not weaken. Break." I had to stop reading again. Just sit there, hands on the pages, because everything I thought had been distance or teenage pulling away was architected, engineered by someone who knew exactly which emotional wires to cut. And right when I thought I had reached the worst of it, I saw another date. The day she disappeared. That was the entry where her tone shifted again. Not frantic, not smug, but triumphant. Melody cried for him today, but it won't last. Children adjust to momentum. If I stay moving, she won't have time to grieve this attachment. Kenneth says to make a clean cut and never look back. Never look back. She wrote it like they were changing apartments, not destroying a childhood. But then, something I hadn't expected at all, at the very bottom of the entry, almost like an afterthought, she scribbled, "If he ever finds this diary, he'll finally understand. And maybe someday she will too." At first I thought she meant it as justification. Later, I realized it was a confession disguised as arrogance. Because somewhere in her mind, even she knew what she was doing was theft. Not escape. Not escape. Theft of a daughter's loyalty. Theft of a father's bond. Theft of truth. I rested my thumb in that exact spot for a long time, because I suddenly understood something that had been foggy for 15 years. Melody never rejected me out of absence. She was trained to, systematically, strategically, years before she ever knew it, and I remember whispering out loud, to no one, because the room was so silent I could hear the refrigerator hum. None of this was her fault, and saying it aloud, it felt like something inside me finally unlocked. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel abandoned, I felt robbed, which meant this wasn't over. Not by miles. Because the next section wasn't about Diane leaving. It was about what she had been running from, and when I read that part, I understood why someone, whoever placed that package on my porch, wanted me to find it now. Before I go into that, if you're still here listening, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this is the moment the story turns from betrayal into revelation. The next section of the diary didn't start like the others. No dates, no rambling justification, just one line at the top of the page. If this ever surfaces, everything collapses. My pulse actually kicked up when I read it, because that wasn't the language of a guilty conscience. That was the language of fear. The handwriting was tighter here. Careful. Almost like she slowed down and measured every word. She wrote about something that started before she ever left. Before Melody was even 5. Back when Diane worked part-time at a clinic downtown, long before Kenneth was in the picture. She didn't write his full name at first, but she referred to him as a man who could make things go away. Someone she owed, not loved. Owed. The farther I read, the more my stomach sank. Because I realized this wasn't just infidelity. This was leverage. She wasn't hiding an affair. She was hiding a debt. And that debt wasn't money. It was evidence. There was a part where she mentioned the registry incident, something I had never heard of. But she wrote about it like it was nuclear, something that could cost her her career, her reputation, and possibly her freedom. Her exact words were, "If the truth surfaces, I don't lose custody. I lose everything." That was when I finally understood. She didn't leave because she chose a new life. She left because she was cornered by the old one. And then, she finally named him, not Kenneth, somebody before Kenneth. A name I didn't recognize, but someone Kenneth knew. Someone he helped her keep buried. Which meant this marriage she paraded as a love story was really an insurance policy. When I turned the page, I found something else tucked into the fold. A photocopy of a document, part of a legal transcript, not public, sealed, and suddenly it clicked. The anonymous package wasn't random. Someone wanted me to know this now. Not 5 years ago, not 15 now. Because whatever this old case was, it wasn't dead. It was circling back, and Diane knew it. The next paragraph shifted tone again. Not legal, not confessional. Something else. Something terrified. She wrote, "If Melody ever learns the full truth about me, she won't just hate me. She'll see him for what he really is. Him. Not me. Not Kenneth either. Someone above him. Someone she spent her entire adulthood running from while pretending she was running toward freedom, and suddenly her choice to weaponize. The good stepfather narrative made perfect sense. If Melody ever saw the mask slip, Diane's whole identity shatters. Because Kenneth isn't her rescuer. He's her shield. A shield she groomed my daughter to emotionally depend on. Not because he's noble, but because he's convenient protection. That realization hollowed me out, but it also lit something under my ribs that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief. Not defeat, momentum. Because if Melody knew even a fraction of this truth, just one piece of it, everything Diane built between them would crack. And I don't mean out of revenge. I mean out of clarity. Kids don't turn away from love on their own. They get redirected, manipulated, starved of full context. I rested my hand on the diary again, and for the first time since the day of the wedding, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like someone had finally, handed me the missing map of the last 15 years. But the next few pages, those weren't reflections. They were instructions. She wrote about what she would do if Melody ever drifted back toward me, how she would counter, how she would remind her of selected memories, how she would reframe the past before I had a chance to give my side, not nurture, programming. And it worked, until now. Because this diary, this secret, is the one thing she never planned for. The truth surviving long enough to reach me. And I hadn't even reached the big revelation yet. Because in the next entry, the part I'm going to tell you in the next module, she finally wrote down what actually happened the year before she left. The thing that could burn down everything she's built since. Before we move on, if you're still following this with me, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because from this point forward, the mask doesn't just crack, it falls off. The next entry in that diary didn't start like a confession. It started like a timeline. A carefully documented sequence of events, every one of them building toward the day she walked out of our lives. She wrote about a man she called RS, initials only. A man who had leverage over her since before Melody could read. A man who threatened to resurface something she had done, or covered up, at that clinic back in Missouri. The tone wasn't emotional here. It was strategic, cold. She wrote, "If he exposes me, I lose everything. If I expose him, I get buried." Which told me one thing. This wasn't an affair. This was blackmail wearing a wedding ring. And then came the part where Kenneth entered the picture. Long before I ever believed he existed. She didn't meet him at some harmless book club like she used to claim. She met him during the containment phase. That was her phrase. He was recruited into her life, not stumbled into it. She didn't fall in love with him. She secured him. And when she wrote about Melody, that was the first time I had to set the diary down and just breathe. She didn't describe motherhood like most mothers do. There was no warmth, no tenderness, just positioning. Melody wasn't her daughter. She was her alibi. Something to make Diane look stable, respectable, normal. Because men like RS don't hesitate to destroy a woman who looks disposable, but they think twice about ripping apart one who looks like a beloved mother rebuilding her life. And suddenly my entire past clicked into focus. All those coincidences. All the times she undermined me subtly. All the emotional distance that started years before she left. She wasn't drifting. She was preparing an exit. Every PTA meeting she forced me to miss by scheduling them on her weeks. Every time she cried to neighbors about being stuck in a loveless home. Every time she framed herself as a survivor. It was all narrative architecture, a story she was constructing out of me. She made me the villain so she could disappear without consequence. And it worked. For 15 years. But the next part of the entry, the part scribbled in handwriting that looked rushed and almost panicked, that's when I realized she never expected this diary to survive her. She wrote, "If Melody ever learns that the clinic didn't lose the file, that I paid to bury it, she'll know the truth about who I really was before she was born. Not who she became. Who she was already. This wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern. She didn't run from one bad thing. She ran from a lifetime of them. And Kenneth? He wasn't her protector. He was her replacement shield when blackmail became too heavy to carry alone." But here's where everything changed. Because toward the bottom of that same page, she stopped writing about herself and started writing about me, not with guilt, not with regret, with fear. She wrote, "If Nathan ever learns the truth, I lose control of the narrative, not custody, not reputation, control." She never cared about love. She cared about control. Control of Melody's story. Control of what their marriage looked like. Control of what people believed about her. And for the first time since the wedding, I realized I wasn't the broken man in this story. I was the only honest one. The diary wasn't her conscience. It was her contingency plan. A blueprint she kept in case she ever needed to manipulate her way through another reinvention. And because someone, whoever sent that package, made sure it landed in my hands, that reinvention, it just ran out of runway. Because after Module 8, you're going to see exactly how this RS figure ties into Kenneth, and how the marriage she paraded in front of the whole town is sitting on a foundation of dynamite. Before I move to the part where the mask completely comes off, make sure you're subscribed, so when the next revelation drops you don't miss how everything unravels. I sat in my truck outside my clinic for a long time before going inside. The sun was setting, turning the gravel lot into a sheet of gold. But all I felt was a kind of gray numbness spreading through my body like cold water. I kept seeing the same two images in my head. Melody smiling on Diane's arm, and Melody's handwriting in that notebook when she was still small enough to fit in my arms. I wish Daddy could hear me. Those 6 words wouldn't let me go. I closed the clinic that day without unlocking the doors. I just sat in my office, lights off, trying to breathe through a feeling I didn't even know how to name. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was erasure. Like 15 years of scraped knees, piano recitals, late-night fevers, spelling tests, homecoming dresses, had been dropped down a well. Around 8 that evening, I finally drove home. I didn't bother with dinner, just heated some water for tea out of muscle memory. The house was too quiet. Normally, when Melody was little, she'd do her homework at the kitchen table while I cooked, tapping her pencil in this soft little rhythm when she was thinking. Funny how silence gets louder when you remember the sound that used to fill it. I took the diary back out. Not because I wanted to torture myself, but because I could tell there was more. The page I'd opened to earlier wasn't the last entry. The handwriting got neater as she got older, but the loneliness never stopped bleeding through the margins. Mom says Dad didn't fight for me. Mom says he was relieved to be free. Mom says real fathers don't stay single if they actually want their kids. I put the book down and just stared at the wall. Diane had rewritten me. Not just the present, but the past too. Every explanation Melody ever had for why her mother left was poisoned, inverted, twisted. I didn't just lose my daughter at that wedding. I'd been losing her slowly for 15 years, one lie at a time. I felt a pressure building in my chest, like grief was trying to claw its way out through my ribs. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally whispered out loud into the empty room. She really believes all of it. There was another entry dated around the time Kenneth entered their lives. Mom says Kenneth is the dad I should have had, the kind who doesn't abandon his family. She says someday I'll understand. That was the moment I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think. Not even once. This wasn't Melody choosing him over me. This was Melody never being given the truth in the first place. Before I turn the page to what Melody wrote as a teenager, and before I show you the part that shattered me more than the wedding ever could, if you're still here listening, I want to thank you. Let me know where you're watching from before we go deeper, because what comes next is where everything turns. I didn't sleep that night. I just kept reading. Every page was another version of me I didn't recognize. A ghost of a father Diane had invented, so she could wear the crown of savior and martyr at the same time. But then the entries changed. Not in tone, in awareness. She was 14 when the cracks started to show. One page said Mom told me not to tell Dad about the parent-teacher conference. She said he doesn't care about school stuff. But when I slipped, he said he didn't even know there was one. Why would she hide that? Then another, Dad drove 3 hours in the rain to bring me the costume I forgot. Why would someone who abandons you do that? That was the first time my throat burned reading instead of going numb. Because it meant she did see me, at least for a moment. Right after that entry came another, written in darker pen strokes, like she was angry at the paper itself. Mom got mad when Dad came to the house to fix the fence. She said he's trying to make her look bad. I don't understand why she hates him helping. There it was, the moment the narrative started slipping. But I also found the moment Diane tightened her grip. A page 2 weeks later read, Mom cried all night. She said if I start taking his side, I'll lose her too. I don't want to lose her. That one hurt. Because I finally saw it. Not from my adult perspective, but from Melody's. She wasn't choosing one parent over another. She was choosing the parent who threatened to disappear again if she didn't obey, because she had already lived through one disappearance. Psychologists have a word for that, parentification, by fear. But when you're a child, it just feels like survival. I ran my thumb along the edge of the book. My heartbeat had slowed into something tight and heavy. I kept reading. The next turning point was when she turned 17. Dad brought flowers to my senior night. I was so happy he came. But Mom told me to walk past him so he wouldn't think he still mattered. I had stood there that night on the edge of the field, holding sunflowers, smiling at her like she was still 8 years old. She barely glanced at me. I thought she just didn't care, but there was one more line under that entry, nearly invisible from how faint the ink was. He still smiled. Why doesn't he ever stop loving me? My hands started shaking, because for the first time in this entire emotional wreckage, I saw proof that she felt it too, that some part of her always knew. And then came the wedding week. The entry that rewrote everything I thought I knew. Mom says having Kenneth walk me down the aisle will heal the story and show people who my real family is. She said if I pick Dad it will ruin everything she's built. Not, I want Kenneth. Not, he deserves it. Just, if I pick Dad, I lose her. My tears didn't fall in a dramatic way, like in movies. It was slower than that, like my body didn't quite know which emotion they belonged to. Rage? No. Heartbreak? Too small. Recognition? Maybe. But then I turned the page, and found the one entry that changed everything. The day before the wedding. I don't know who I'm honoring anymore. Him or the lie. That was the moment I realized I never lost my daughter. I just wasn't allowed to be kept. And as painful as it was to read her confusion, there was something else there. A fight she wasn't ready to finish, but had already started. Because lies survive silence. But truth waits, and hers was closer than she realized. 2 days after I finished the diary, I asked Melody to meet me. Not to confront her, not to demand anything, just to talk. We met at a quiet little park by the lake. The same one where I used to push her on the swings when she was barely tall enough for her feet to touch the sand. She looked nervous when she arrived, guarded, like she was bracing for a court hearing. Not a conversation with her father. I didn't pull out the diary right away. I didn't mention the wedding. I just asked her one question. When did you stop believing I loved you? She froze, not shocked, exposed. Her mouth opened like she wanted to speak, but didn't have permission from her own mind to form the words. When I finally pulled the small leather book from my coat pocket, her entire face changed. She didn't look angry. She looked 8 years old again, lost and scared. I wasn't supposed to see this, I said softly, and you were never supposed to carry this alone. She covered her mouth with her hand and sank onto the bench beside me. And then the walls she'd lived behind for 15 years, walls someone else built, started to crack. Dad, her voice broke. I didn't know how to choose without losing someone. I put my hand over hers. You were never supposed to choose. You were supposed to have both. She started crying. Not loud, just the kind of crying a person does when their ribs are trying to remember how to breathe again. And in that moment, I didn't get my position in the wedding back, but I got my daughter back, and the truth. That was the aisle that mattered.